When he stood before the murdered man, he shook as with a palsy, and he put his face in his hands and burst into tears. "I didn't do it, friends," he sobbed. "'Pon my word and honor, I have never done it." "Who's accused you?" shouted a voice. This shot seemed to carry home. Potter lifted his face and looked around him with a pathetic hopelessness in his eyes. He saw Injun Joe and exclaimed, "Oh, Injun Joe, you promised me you would never—" "Is that your knife?" And it was thrust before him by the sheriff. Potter would have fallen if they had not caught him and eased him to the ground. Then he said, "Something told me. If I didn't come back and get—" He shuddered, then waved his nerveless hand with a vanquished gesture and said, "Tell him, Joe, tell him. It ain't any use anymore." Then Huckleberry and Tom stood dumb and staring, and heard the stony-hearted liar reel off his serene statement. They expecting every moment that the clear sky would deliver God's lightnings upon his head, and wondering to see how long the stroke was delayed. And when he had finished and still stood alive and whole, the wavering impulse to break their oath and save the poor betrayed prisoner's life faded and vanished away. For playing this miscreant had sold himself to Satan, and it would be fatal to meddle with the property of such a power as that. "Why didn't you leave? What did you want to come here upon him?" Somebody said. I couldn't help it, Potter moaned. "I wanted to run away, but I couldn't seem to come anywhere but here." And he fell to sobbing again. Injun Joe repeated his statement, just as calmly, a few minutes afterward, on the inquest, under oath, and the boys, seeing that the lightnings were still withheld, were confirmed in their belief that Joe had sold himself to the devil. He was now become to them the most balefully interesting object they had ever looked upon, and they could not take their fascinated eyes from his face. They inwardly resolved to watch him nights, when opportunities should offer, in the hope of getting a glimpse of his dread master. Injun Joe raised the body of the murdered man and put it in the wagon for removal, and it was whispered through the shuddering crowd that the wound bled a little. The boys thought that this happy circumstance would turn suspicion in the right direction, but they were disappointed, for more than one villager remarked, "It was within 3 feet of Muff Potter when it done." Tom's fearful, sacred, and gnawing conscience disturbed his sleep for as much as a week after this. And at a breakfast one morning, Sid said, "Tom, you pitched around and talk in your sleep so much that you keep me awake half the time." Tom blanched and dropped his eyes. "It's a bad sign," said Aunt Polly gravely. "What you got on your mind, Tom?" Nothing I know of." But the boy's hands shook that he spilled his coffee. "And you do talk such stuff," Sid said. "Last night you said it's blood. That's what it is. You said that over and over, and you said, 'Don't torment me so. I will tell.' Tell what? What did you tell?" Everything was swimming before Tom. There is no telling what might happen now. But luckily, the concern passed out of Aunt Polly's face, and she came to Tom's relief without knowing it. She said, "Shoo! It's that dreadful murder. I dream about it most every night, myself. Sometimes I dream it's me that done it. Mary said she had been affected much the same way. Sid seemed satisfied. Tom got out of the presence as quick as he plausibly could. And after that he complained of toothache for a week and tied up his jaw every night. He never knew that Sid lay nightly watching and frequently slipped the bandage free and then leaned on his elbow listening a good while at a time, and afterward slipped the bandage back to its place again. Tom's distress of mind wore off gradually, and the toothache grew irksome and was discarded. If Sid really managed to make anything out of Tom's disjointed mutterings, he kept it to himself. It seemed to Tom that his class schoolmates never would get done holding inquest on dead cats, and thus keeping his trouble present to his mind. Sid noticed that Tom never was coronered at one of these inquiries, though it had been his habit to take the lead in all new enterprises. He noticed, too, that Tom never acted as a witness, and that was strange. And Sid did not overlook the fact that Tom even showed a marked aversion to these inquests, and always avoided them when he could. Sid marveled, but said nothing. However, even inquests went out of work at last, and ceased to torture Tom's conscience. Every day or two, during this time of sorrow, Tom watched his opportunity and went to the little grated jail, and smuggled such small comforts through to the murdered as he could get off. The jail was a trifling little brick that stood in a marsh at the edge of the village, and no guards were afforded for it. Indeed, it was seldom occupied. These offerings greatly helped to ease Tom's conscience. The villagers had a strong desire to tar and feather Injun Joe and ride him on a rail for body snatching, but so formidable was his character that nobody could be found who was willing to take the lead in the matter, so it was dropped. He had been careful to begin both of inquest statements with the fight, without confessing the grave robbery that preceded it. Therefore, it was deemed wisest not to try the case in the courts at present. Chapter 7. One of the reasons why Tom's mind had drifted away from its secret trouble was that it had found a new weighty matter to interest itself about. Becky Thatcher had stopped coming to school. Tom had struggled with his pride a few days, and tried to whistle her down the wind, but failed. He began to himself hanging around her father's house nights and feeling very miserable. She was ill. What if she should die? There was distraction in the thought. He no longer took an interest in war, nor even in piracy. The charm of life was gone. There was nothing but dreadness left. He put his hoop away, and his bat. There was no joy in them anymore. His aunt was concerned. She began to try all the manners of remedies on him. She was one of those people who are infatuated with patent medicines and all new-fangled methods of producing health or mending it. She was an inveterate experimenter in these things. When something fresh in this line came out, she was in a favor. Right away, to try it, not on herself, for she was never ailing, but on anybody else that came handy. She was a subscriber for all the health, periodical, chronological frauds, and the solemn ignorance they were inflated with was breath to her nostrils. All the rot they contained about ventilation, and how to go to bed, and how to get up, and what to eat, and what to drink, and how much exercise to take, and frame of mind to keep oneself in, and what sort of clothing to wear, was all gobsell. And she never observed that her health journals of the current month customarily upset everything they had recommended the month before. She was as simple-hearted and honest as the day was long, and so she was an easy victim. She gathered together her quack periodicals and her quack medicines, and thus, armed with that, and went about on her pale horse, metaphorically speaking, with hell following after. But she never suspected that she was not an angel of healing and the balm of Gilead in disguise. To the suffering neighbors. The water treatment was new, now, and Tom's low condition was a windfall to her. She had him out daylight every morning, stirred him up in the woodshed and drowned him with a deluge of cold water. Then she scrubbed him down with a towel like a file, and so brought him to. Then she rolled him up in a wet sheet and put him away under blankets, till she sweated his soul clean and the yellow stains of it came through the pores, as Tom said. Yet, notwithstanding all this, the boy grew more and more melancholy and pale and dejected. She added hot baths, sitz baths, shower baths, and plunges. The boy remained as dismal as a hearse. She began to assist water with a slim oatmeal diet and blister plasters. She calculated his capacity as she would Ajax, and filled him up every day with a Quaker owls. Tom had indifferent to persecutions by this time. This phase filled the old lady's heart with concentration. This indifference must be broken at any cost. Now she heard of painkillers for the first time. She ordered a lot at once. She tasted it, and it was filled with gratitude. It was simply fire in a liquid form. She dropped the water treatment and everything else, and pinned her faith to painkiller. She gave Tom a teaspoonful and watched with the deepest anxiety for the result. Her troubles were instantly at rest, her soul at peace again, for the indifference was broken up. The boy could not have shown a wilder, healthier interest if she had built a fire under him. Tom felt that it was time to wake up. This sort of life might be romantic enough in his blighted condition, but it was getting to have a little sentiment, too much distracting variety about it. So he thought over various plans for relief, and finally hit upon of the profession to be fond of painkiller. He asked for it so often that he became nice, and his aunt ended by telling him to help himself and quite bothering her. If it had been Sid, she would have had no misgiving to alloy her delight. But since it was Tom, she watched the bottle clandestinely. She found that the medicine did really diminish. But it did not occur to her that the boy was mending the health of a crack in the sitting room floor with it. One day, Tom was in the act of dozing the crack when his aunt Yellow Cat came along, purring, eyeing to the teaspoon avariciously, and begging for a taste. Tom said, "Don't ask for it unless you want it, Peter." But Peter signified that he didn't want it. "You better make sure." Peter was sure. "Now you have asked for it, and I will give it to you, because there ain't any meat about me. But if you find you don't like it, you mustn't blame anybody but your own self." Peter was agreeable, so Tom pried his mouth open and poured down the painkiller. Peter sprang a couple of yards in the air, and then delivered a war whoop and set off round and round the room, banging against furniture, upsetting flower pots, and making general havoc. Next, he rose on his feet and pranced around, in a frenzy of enjoyment, with his hat over his shoulder, and his voice proclaiming his unpleasable happiness. And he went tearing around the house again, spreading chaos and destruction in his path. Aunt Polly entered in the time to see him throw a few double somersets, deliver a final mighty hurrah, and sail through the open window, carrying the rest of the flower pots with him. The old lady stood petrified with astonishment, peering over her glasses. Tom lay on the floor, expiring with laughter. "Tom, what on earth ailed that cat?" "I don't know, Aunt," gasped the boy. "Why, I never see anything like it. What did make him act so?" "'Deed, I don't know, Aunt Polly. Cat always act so when they're having a good time." "They do they?" There was something in the tone that made Tom apprehensive. "Yes, that is, I believe they do." "You do?" "Yes, ma'am." The old lady was bending down, Tom watching, with interest emphasized by anxiety. Too late he divined her drift. The handle of the telltale teaspoon was invisible under the bed valance. Aunt Polly took it, held it up. Tom winced, and dropped his eyes. Aunt Polly raised him by the usual handle, his ear, and cracked his head soundly with her thimble. "Now, sir, what did you want to treat that poor dumb beast so for?" "I done it out of pity for him, because he hadn't any aunt." "Hadn't any aunt? You numbskull. What has that got to do with it?" "Heaps. Because if he had done, once she would have burnt him out herself. She would have roasted his bowels out of him, without any more feeling than if he was a human." Aunt Polly felt a sudden pang of remorse. This was putting the thing in a new light. What was cruelty to a cat might be cruelty to a boy. She began to soften. She felt sorry. Her eyes watered a little, and she put her hand on Tom's head and said gently, "I was meaning for the best, Tom. And, Tom, it did do you good?" Tom looked up in her face with just a perceptible twinkle peeping through his gravity. "I know you was meaning for the best, Auntie, and so was I with Peter. It done him good, too. I never see him get around so since. Oh, go, long with you, Tom, before you aggravate me. And you try and see if you can't be good boy, for once. You needn't to take any more medicine." Tom reached school ahead of time. It was noticed that this strange thing had been occurring every day latterly. And now, as is usual of late, he hung about of the gate of the schoolyard instead of playing with his comrades. He was sick, he said, and he looked it. He tried to be seemed to be looking everywhere, but whither he was really looking? Down the road. Presently, Jeff Thatcher hove in sight, and Tom's face lighted. He gazed a moment, and then turned sorrowfully away. When Jeff arrived, Tom accosted him, and led up rarely to opportunities for remark about Becky. But the giddy lad never could see the bait. Tom watched and watched, hoping whenever a frisking frog came in sight, and hating the owner of it as soon as he saw she was not the right one. At last, frogs ceased to appear, and he dropped hopelessly into the dumps. He entered the empty schoolhouse and sat down to suffer. Then one more frog passed in the gate. Tom's heart gave a great bound. The next instant he was out, and going on, like an Indian, yelling, laughing, chasing boys, jumping over the fence at the risk of life and limb, throwing handsprings, standing on his head, doing all the heroic things he could conceive of, and keeping a furtive eye out, all the while, to see if Becky Thatcher was noticing. But she seemed to be unconscious of it all. She never looked. Could it be possible she was not aware that he was there? He carried his exploits to her immediate vicinity, came war-whooping around, snatched a boy's cap, hurled it to the roof of the schoolhouse, broke through a group of boys, tumbling them in every direction, and fell sprawling himself under Becky's nose, almost upsetting her, and she turned with her nose in the air and heard her say, "Some of the people there they think they might be smart." Always showing off. Tom's cheeks burned. He gathered himself up and sneaked off, crushed and crestfallen. Chapter 8. Tom's mind was made up now. He was gloomy and desperate. He was a forsaken, friendless boy. He said nobody loved him. When they found out what they had driven him to, perhaps they would be sorry, if he had tried to do it right and get along. But they would not let him, since nothing would do to them but rid of him. Let it be so, and let them blame him for the consequences. Why shouldn't they? What right had the friendless to complain? Yes, they had forced him to it at last. He would lead a life of crime. There was no choice. By this time he was far down Meadow Lane, and the bell for school to take up tinkled faintly upon his ear. He sobbed, now, to think he should never hear that old familiar sound anymore. It was very hard, but it was forced on him. Since he was driven out into the cold world, he must submit. But he forgave them. Then the sobs came thick and fast. Just at this point, he met his soul's sworn comrade Joe Harper, hard-eyed, and with evidently a great and dismal purpose in his heart. Plainly, here were two souls with but a single thought. Tom, wiping his eyes with his sleeve, began to blubber out something about resolution to escape from hard usage and lack of sympathy, at home by roaming abroad into the great world never to return, and ended by hoping that Joe would not forget him. But it transpired that this was a request which Joe had just been going to make of Tom, and had come to hunt him up for that purpose. His mother had whipped him for drinking some cream which he had never tasted, and knew nothing about. It was plain that she was tired of him and wished him to go. If she felt that way, there was nothing for him to do but to succumb. He hoped she would be happy, and never regret having driven her poor boy out into the unfeeling world to suffer and die. As the two boys walked sorrowing along, they made a new compact to stand by each other and be brothers, and never separate till death relieved them of their troubles. Then they began to lay their plans. Joe was for being a hermit and living on crusts in a remote cave, and dying, sometime, of cold and want and grief. But after listening to Tom, he conceded that there were some conspicuous advantages about a life of crime, and so he consented to be a pirate. 3 miles below St. Petersburg, at a point where the Mississippi River was a trifle over a mile wide, there was a long, narrow, wooded island with a shallow bar at the head of it, and this offered well as a reservoir. It was not inhabited. It lay far over toward the further shore, abreast a dense and almost wholly unpeopled forest. So Jackson's Island was chosen. Who were to be subject of their piracies was a matter that did not occur to them. Then they hunted up Huckleberry Finn, and he joined them promptly, for all carriers were one to him, he was indifferent. They presently separated to meet at a lonely spot on the river bank, 2 miles above the village, at the favorite hour, which was midnight. There was a small log raft there which they meant to capture. Each would bring hooks and lines, and such provisions as he could steal in the most dark and mysterious way, as become outlaws. And before the afternoon was done, they had all managed to enjoy the sweet glory of spreading the fact that pretty soon the town would hear something up. All who got this vague hint were cautioned to be mum and wait. About midnight, Tom arrived with a boiled ham and a few trifles and stopped in a dense undergrowth on a small bluff overlooking the meeting place. It was starlight and very still. The mighty river lay like an ocean at rest. Tom listened a moment, but no sound disturbed the quiet. Then he gave a low, distinct whistle. It was answered from under bluff. Tom whistled twice more. The signal were answered in the same way. Then a guarded voice said, Who goes there? Tom Sawyer, the Black Avenger of the Spanish Main. Name your names. Huck, Finn the Red-Handed, and Joe Harper the Terror of the Seas. Tom had furnished these titles from his favorite literature. 'Tis well. Give the countersign. 2 hoarse whispers delivered the same awful word simultaneously, in the brooding night. Blood. Then Tom tumbled his ham over the bluff and let himself down after it, tearing both skin and clothes to some extent in the effort.